Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I like to discuss the main views of a range of economists who offered their forecasts to the Financial Times, as they do at the beginning of each year. And to say they think that we're screwed wouldn't be news exactly, but what exactly are the main messages? It seems to be that people are going to notice, and maybe people will see what a Tory vote buys them. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, how screwed are people in 2023? It's going to be an extremely unpleasant year. As inflation remains high, it'll come down, but it'll still be high. The economy continues to contract. The government still try to drain money from the bottom to the top at an alarming rate at such a time. You know, in this video, it's based on an article in the Financial Times, I'll say, which I'll link, but it does tend to be behind a paywall, just warn you. They do this exercise each year. They contact 100 expert economists to give their main thoughts on where 2023 is going to lead us. And in terms of what's already known, we know that the UK is likely to experience a deeper and longer recession than average advanced economies. Even the Eurozone, that scuppers one angle that Brexiteers like to take. We know that our economy, alone amongst advanced economies, still lags behind our pre-COVID GDP. Brexiteers can stick their fingers in their ears all they like, but all of the global issues that they like to point to affected every single one of the other advanced economies, and in some cases more severely. But it's only us that decided to impose trade sanctions on ourselves. And speaking of Brexit, the initial summary of the article, before it gets into the quotes from each individual economist, explains that we're going to continue to suffer long-term economic damage due to Brexit. Quote from the article says, the impact of Brexit and poor investment growth are expected to affect the UK longer-term economic performance. So not just a year or two, longer term. And at first I wondered, well, why mention investment growth separately to Brexit? Because Brexit has, of course, hampered investment. Right from 2016, we saw an immediate effect after the Brexit referendum vote. Before we'd even left, we saw that impact on both foreign and domestic business investment. But I suppose investment also includes government investment. I mean, that didn't have to be reduced because of Brexit, but it has been. But I'll tell you what's really compelling about the overall views of these economists. Because I look through them each year, as I say. And last year they were pretty bad. And because normally, as you'd expect, they set out what are the major factors which are going to impact economic performance in the year. But it's all really the sort of stuff, you know, you can see if you're following it, you can see it in the data when it turns up. But it won't necessarily be noticed by the general public. But these economists are suggesting that 2023 is going to see such a drop in living standards that there will be no mistake in it. A key statement from a professor of economics at the LSE, Professor Nicholas Barr. Growth in the UK will be below average for the G7 and EU. Households will feel the effects acutely. The second year of poor economic performance coming on top of falling real pay in 2022 will adversely affect living standards both in reality and perception. Now, just to emphasise the standout bits for me, households will feel the effects acutely. In other words, it will be very, very unpleasant and will adversely affect living standards both in reality and perception. Important point there, because living standards have been falling all the time the Tories have been in power, but not always in a way that people have noticed. The point that people actually notice is really important. It is why I cannot understand why most Tory MPs are not pulling their fingers out. I appreciate that the Tory party is currently in the grip of the far right and their ideology, an ideology that does not care if the Conservatives drum themselves out of office for a generation, as long as they get what they want first. But it is absolutely ridiculous that Tory MPs are not mindful about just what they've done and continuing to do. You know, Conservatives typically do use recessions as an excuse to sell off national assets with the excuse that, oh, we must cut costs. It's always economic nonsense. Government borrowing is supposed to be for just such a time. If you cut public services or make them more difficult or less effective, then at a time of economic contraction when businesses are already struggling, you force them to struggle even more. But they've gotten away with it in the past because there's then a little period of growth in between. Lower growth if the Tories are in office, but a period of growth where the pressure is eased a little bit. But what happened in 2010 was that the Conservative government, which went in full steam ahead, undermining public services, there's not really been a period when that pressure was eased. While they've been in office, there has been no easing of the pressure, where public sector funding, whether workers' pay or other spending, has recovered, even partially. They destroyed the infrastructure and then they just borrowed in order to compensate for the subsequent loss of tax receipts. The result is that the national debt is way higher than it was in the wake of the banking crisis, even before COVID. Obviously, there was then some reasonable borrowing during COVID. And now we've got another recession, along with very high inflation. The government are still trying to squeeze spending even more. But what economists like Professor Barr are saying is, people are not just going to suffer a drop in living standards that an economist can see. They can look at the graph and go, oh, yeah, they've got less money. They're going to notice it. Because what normally happens with people, so let's say you've got enough money to get by. Cost of living goes up by whatever, let's say, this year it's been about 10%, and your income goes up by, say, 5%. So actually, if you were to look at your budget and work out what you've spent and what you've had coming in, you were worse off than you were the year before, right? Because there was less money to put aside for savings or to spend on your holiday or whatever it is. And if you did that, if every household did that exercise every year, they'll notice that their standard of living, their buying power has been going down every single year. But as long as you can still buy the stuff you want, you don't notice. Let's be honest, most people, I'm not excluding myself from this even, most people just look at what they've got coming in and they go, right, that's what I've got to spend this month. They'll put a bit aside for the holiday or something like that. But generally speaking, that's how people live. They judge what they can afford by what they've got left in the bank as they go through the month. All of a sudden, if it's not a case of, if it's a case of actually, hang on, I used to be able to afford this quite easily, now I can't. Oh, I'm going to have to do without the holiday altogether, or without, food for some people, or without the heating over winter. All of a sudden you notice it. Another economist, Professor David Cobham of the Heriot-Watt University, said this: most households will feel hard up as austerity and Brexit come home to roost, and the government has no coherent strategy for dealing with, never mind reversing the effects. Right now, Sunak is making claims about, I'm going to halve inflation, right? Which is likely to happen anyway, so he can claim a success in bringing the economy back under control. But the usual political conjuring trick is not as likely to work as in the past, because people will notice that prices are still going up a lot. Like when prices go up, but you can still easily afford it, you don't really notice as much. You get your shopping, you do your shopping as you go out, and it costs what it costs, and that's it, and that's all it is. At the very least, even if you do notice, it seems to be a bit more expensive these days, you don't dwell on it because you can still afford it. But when your budget is very tight, that rising cost, it's not just something you notice. It's not even just a budgeting problem. It represents the thing you now have to do without. Even for like middle-class Tory voters who may have to cut back on things rather than do without essentials, they will still notice the drop in living standards, not because they're left with less disposable income after spending, because like I say, that's been happening for years, but because they will now have to make a conscious decision to change to a cheaper version of something, or do without the foreign holiday, which I suppose will at least dispense with the pointing and laughing at border control, or something else that they're used to having and taking for granted. And the thing about these forecasts is that there will always be unexpected factors that affect them. Like last year, it was Russia launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And although, it was being discussed last year, the start of last year or the end of the year before, it is probable that some economies, they may have considered it, but there was no way for them to predict how the campaign would play out this year. They're not military or political strategists, they're economists. There'll probably be something unexpected in 2023 as well. But whatever it is won't be good news for us. What could possibly boost our fortunes? You can see any number of things that might hamper it even more, but what's going to boost them? Yes, if we had a general election in March, maybe, but realistically, any unexpected event is likely to be negative. Consider the issues we still have. The war in Ukraine is still ongoing. There's no credible prospect of going back to normal trading relations with Russia for many years at least. So those supply chains that have been changing are going to have to carry on changing. The government are actively blocking the development of sustainable energy in favour of fossil fuels, which will leave us vulnerable to international volatility until we deal with that. The pay restraint is literally preventing many workers from feeding themselves and their families. They're not striking because they fancy more money. They're striking because they cannot manage on the slave wages, in what are effectively slave wages in lots of parts of the country. Money is just draining upwards. It's draining upwards at an unsustainable rate. And it seems likely that 2023 is the year when people will stop coming up with excuses for the Tories. You know, this is partly why I said last summer, when the Tory leadership contest was going on, I could absolutely see it was absolutely possible for a replacement to Boris Johnson to close the gap with Labour in the autumn. I could see the gap closing right down, I said. You know, if Liz Truss didn't go mad. And you know, because the public will be fair, they always give the new leader the benefit of the doubt. But 2023 would see them come unstuck, as the crushing consequences of their economic madness would really bite very hard. Well, we did get Liz Truss, and we did get Liz Truss going mad, making the situation way worse. So as bad as I thought 2023 would be for the public, it's now going to be even worse. You know, this should be the year when the Tories actually become unelectable. It's just a shame that so many millions of people will have to suffer for it to happen. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.